This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
We know that cell therapy is a growing topic of conversation, that programs are trying to understand what the demand and projections looks like in this space, especially considering the high cost of these drugs, as well as when you think about likely the inpatient stay associated with them, maybe potentially downstream treatments, even long-term care associated with delivering something like cell therapy.
Hello, and welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I'm your host, Tori Richie. I'm really excited about today's episode because we get to talk all things innovation with three of our subject matter experts. I am joined by experts that span our service line teams. We've got representation from cancer, neurosciences, and spine, medicine, and imaging. Emily Smith, Gurmeet, Bawa, and Setu Shah, thank you so much for joining. Innovation is a key area that we focused on building out stories in the 2024 refresh of the Impact of Change forecast. Emily, I want to start with you in the medicine service line. What are some of the key medical innovations that you and Justin thought about this year?
So much amazing stuff has happened this past year. When thinking about medical innovations, the first one that comes to mind, that 2023 was a big year for gene therapy approval. We saw the first CRISPR therapy approved specifically for sickle cell, which is a technology that can be used to selectively modify DNA. And this is really only the beginning for gene therapies. We expect about 10 to 20 gene therapies to be approved every year from here on out. So that's really exciting, especially for our hematology service line. I know that infusions and biologics have been really big for our gastroenterology, rheumatology, and dermatology service lines. And then lastly, it wouldn't be innovation without speaking about GLP-1s. We've carved that story out, thinking about these new medications and the benefits they can have to chronic care. I know that that's a really high level, but a lot of really exciting things going on right now.
It is high level, and it's difficult to talk about without giving our listeners a visual here. We carved out a number of new procedures this year as well as it relates to the forecast, one of which being immune effector cell therapy, which spans a variety of service lines, both more medical service lines as well as cancer. Setu and Emily, I'm curious, how did you both navigate building this new procedural forecast, and what are some of the drivers that's driving the growth here?
We really worked, Tori, with our organizations, with our members to build this procedure. We know that cell therapy is a growing topic of conversation, that programs are trying to understand what the demand and projections looks like in this space, especially considering the high cost of these drugs, as well as when you think about likely the inpatient stay associated with them, maybe potentially downstream treatments, even long-term care associated with delivering something like cell therapy. We work directly with our members, and something simple as even the nomenclature, understanding the type of terminology. One of the earliest indicators of cell therapy was CAR T. A lot of our programs are already doing CAR T, but we've really encouraged our programs to think even more broadly. That's where the new procedure, immune effector cell therapy, came into play. And it's a procedure that's broken out both on the inpatient side as well as outpatient side. That was a challenging dynamic for us to forecast as well. We know that a lot of cell therapy started in the blood cancer space, but we've also started to see approvals in the solid tumors as well. And in March, we got a recent new approval as it relates to melanoma. So when we think about cell therapy as a broader procedure group, but even things that start to disrupt cell therapy, one thing that's come up is bispecific. So this is another T-cell based type of therapy that programs are starting to understand what's the demand and whether they can offer this. The key part of bispecific is it's known more as that off-the-shelf type of therapy. So it doesn't require that same manufacturing time as CAR T. For programs who are able to manage the adverse events and hospitalizations as it relates to bispecific, may have a role to play here. We heard at Vizient's recent Cell Gene Specialty Symposium that this is starting to impact folks' CAR T volumes. We only have limited approvals currently. We may start to see this have a bigger impact, specifically for our community hospitals that choose to offer this type of thing. And they can start playing in that cell therapy space that may have seemed a little daunting early in the game.
When we think on the medicine side, these volumes are still pretty small, and these medications and therapies do have a lot of headwinds right now. But while the volumes are small, when thinking about each individual patient that is going to be affected by these types of innovations and these types of treatments, it's really exciting. So it's a small but mighty procedure.
Small but mighty indeed. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's where the sickle cell gene therapy lives, correct?
I believe so. And it's really exciting right now because the first patient is undergoing the FDA-approved treatment for sickle cell. He's at Children's National Hospital in DC. It's really exciting to watch his story and see it from a patient and a family perspective.
That's one of the most thrilling parts of working on the forecast is thinking about the life-saving treatments that are being developed and deployed in real time. And we then get to think through what is the impact of that? What is the scale to which this innovation is going to drive meaning and life-saving therapies to folks that otherwise didn't have very many options?
Oh, completely. Especially for sickle cell, these treatments can be curative. This could decrease inpatient utilization for that patient for the rest of their life and could also significantly decrease outpatient utilization. When mentioning the gene therapies, I think it's important to talk about some of the barriers that we're seeing in terms of price and access to these medications, that these therapies right now, sickle cell, it's $3 million for this specific treatment. Thinking about it from a health system perspective, how can you navigate with manufacturers and payers in order to provide this high ultra specialty pharmacy care for patients?
Some of the other key procedures where there's quite a bit of innovation that gets incorporated into the forecast are infusion procedures. And when I think about some of the recent FDA approvals, we've seen the neurosciences service line be impacted by new drug therapies that have come on the market there. Gurmeet, could you share some of the medical innovation stories hitting the neuroservice line?
We are seeing that the new therapeutics for dementia, they're going to actually have a lot of downstream requirements, especially with imaging. Over the years, we've seen an expansion in diagnostic reimbursement. In 2022, CMS adjusted its national coverage determination for beta amyloid PET scans, dementia, and neurodegenerative disease to allow one scan per beneficiary in their lifetime. Just last October 2023, this NCD was removed entirely, and it eliminated that one scan limitation and putting coverage, and it actually put the coverage determination decisions in the hands of local Medicare administrative contractors. Due to this modification, we do have growth within advanced imaging PET scans for dementia, as it will expand access to various patient populations. When we look at PET scans, that's really used as an initial diagnostic for Alzheimer's and dementia, and is a key prerequisite testing modality for patients being evaluated for amyloid targeting therapeutics. For MRI, we see that we increased our forecast there for dementia, and that's due to the monitoring that's required for emerging therapeutics. Growth with PET is expected to increase as the national coverage determination restriction, which has been restricted to once-in-a-lifetime coverage for PET scans, has been retired altogether, and that will expand access to this patient population. Now, when we're talking about MRI, growth here is going to be attributed to the monitoring that's required for the emerging therapeutics.
What I think is also really interesting about the neurosciences service line and particularly infusion services is while we've projected rather robust growth in infusion services for dementia, in addition to those downstream services that you mentioned with the imaging and diagnostics, because of innovation, we're also seeing growth, not decline, but soften in other areas like multiple sclerosis, which it's fascinating to understand because of innovation within the same procedure, you're going to realize very different implications on that billable volume utilization.
Absolutely, Tori. You bring up a great point when it comes down to multiple sclerosis. The disruption that we see there with the infusion volumes, that's really driven by those therapeutic advances that enable fewer infusions per patient, as well as the shift to alternative treatment options, which include oral therapy, self-administered subcutaneous injections. Some of the considerations that health systems must take into account have to be patient preference, physician prescribing patterns, as well as economic incentives. That's all impacting infusions, specifically for the multiple sclerosis patient population within neurosciences.
Yeah, we see similar trends playing out in the cancer service line. Setu, with chemotherapy perhaps being transformed into an oral versus an intravenous drug.
Absolutely, Tori. That's something we've been watching closely as we think about chemotherapy infusion volumes. One of the potential impacts is that shift to more subcutaneous type of administration. We've seen programs incorporate fast-track chairs to see more patients increase that throughput as a result. It is going to be patient and condition specific. Not all patients may be eligible for that subcutaneous administration, but it will start to have an impact on infusion volumes. Gurmeet brought up orals that can span all of our service lines when we think about orals. It's something we've been watching as well, especially as it relates to expanding indications, expanding drugs, manufacturers investing more dollars in this space. When we think about increased incidence in cancer, potentially older people getting cancer, they may be more inclined to take an oral versus an infusion or an injection. When we think about potentially geriatric populations as it relates to cancer, this is something we have to start considering as it relates to patient preference, as well as that long-term care that patients may need as it relates to infusions or chemotherapy.
I want to shift us from talking about pharmaceutical innovation to some of the diagnostic innovation that we're currently researching and experiencing. And Gurmeet, I know that this is a huge area of interest for you. What are you seeing in the imaging space that's coming down the pike in terms of innovation advances?
One of the biggest things that we're seeing in regards to imaging is point of care modalities where you're bringing the imaging to the patient versus bringing the patient to the imaging. Last year, I had the privilege to attend the RSNA, the Radiology Society of North America's annual meeting, and there were many different modalities out there and advancements, especially with portables. We're definitely seeing the incorporation of these technologies to the front lines.
That's a great point, Gurmeet. I think even something we've been watching on the cancer side is that earlier last year, RadNet announced a partnership as it relates to mammograms. They've in fact started pilot sites more in rural settings. So when we think about access to imaging, access to cancer screening, this is a growing topic of conversation we've always talked about here at SG2. How do you bring imaging closer to the patient? And we're really starting to see other non-traditional health system players play in this space and increase that access to cancer screenings, specifically those in maybe not as accessible settings.
Which I think is such an important story to hit on, is as you open up access, more screenings is going to result in more findings. That's just the nature of it. And so often people will look at particularly our cancer forecast and they'll immediately jump to, has there been a rise in incidence? And sometimes the case is yes, but sometimes the screening guidelines have changed or access to screening services have changed. Setu, you make a great point that we're likely to see an uptick in findings due to increased access with bringing the modality to the patient. We're also likely to continue to see an increase in findings with shifting to new screening protocols like using Cologuard, for example, where the screening actually occurs in somebody's home.
You bring up a great point, Tori. That's always something we're trying to balance on the cancer side. Increased screening, does that mean to increase findings? But potentially with some of this stuff, we start to be able to get early stage cancers. And that's the goal, to be able to get a cancer more early stage. And something we've been hearing from our clients is things like cervical cancer or the other cancer types that historically immigrant populations or populations with the disparities have put off. They're starting to see those appear more and potentially in those ED settings. And I know the ED is likely a different conversation for a whole other day, but this is something we're constantly tracking here at SG2, that balance between screening guidelines and how it affects downstream utilization. And I know Emily has some great thoughts on Cologuard.
Yeah, it's a conversation I've had with quite a few members recently. There's so much growth to be had in outpatient GI services, specifically screening and diagnostic colonoscopies. But that growth doesn't really matter if you can't get patients in the front door. And oftentimes we see health systems have a wait list of 6 months, 8 months, even a year to receive a screening colonoscopy, which if you're a patient, that's really scary to have to wait that long to see if you have something. Thinking about what can you successfully move to a disruptor like a Cologuard, or there was one recently approved this year called ColoSense, very similar style like Cologuard, that it's a DNA fit test that you take at home. One thing that we're also thinking about is liquid biopsies for cancer. So that could possibly detract utilization from screening or diagnostic colonoscopy, but screening mammography, something that we're watching. And all in all, it's how can you shift some of those volumes to different levels of care based on patient acuity or risk.
Emily, you brought up liquid biopsy, and that's something that we consider into specifically our imaging forecast. By no means is liquid biopsy ready for that widespread use. The reality is it's something people are starting to use. We see it used at certain health systems. We see it used even offered by certain employers, such as Princeton University. One of the case studies that we recently presented at a presentation was Mercy using multi-cancer early detection tests within their system as well. While it's not ready for prime time and for all populations, it is a service offering that programs are starting to use, whether it's as it relates to concierge care or even potentially referrals. And we start to consider this in our imaging forecast as it relates to reference testing. Because they're not ready for prime time, you often need to perform a liquid biopsy and at the same time performing some level of imaging or screening to validate that finding in a liquid biopsy. So something that we're continuously tracking here on the cancer side. This is going to be a top conversation at ASCO's upcoming conference in Chicago. So I'm sure we'll get some latest on as it relates to liquid biopsies as well there.
We've hit medical innovation. We've hit diagnostic innovation. Now I want to touch a bit on surgical innovation, where the proliferation of minimally invasive surgical techniques is thrilling and opening up new opportunities to treat patients. I feel like one of the most compelling stories to come out of the forecast this year centers around neurosciences and some of the advances being made here. Gurmeet, could you share a bit more?
The advances that we see in minimally invasive surgery, especially for intracerebral hemorrhage treatment, that's going to further the need for stroke network optimization overall. We see specifically within our hemorrhagic stroke ICH care family, looking at the brain and skull surgery, including resection procedure, growth there that's really led by innovation and technology, attributed to advances in minimally invasive surgical technology, as well as further data that's been gleaned from clinical trials, specifically the ENRICH trial, which has been showing the benefit of minimally invasive surgery for ICH, including reduction in mortality as well as the potential to expand the patient pool.
It wouldn't be a conversation about innovation if I didn't ask Emily about the weight management drugs and how perhaps the forecast has evolved over the last 2 refresh cycles. Could you share with us a bit what the latest story is here?
Oh gosh, we learn something new every single day about GLP-1 medications. Thinking short, mid, and long term for these medications, we're still experiencing some headwinds in the short term, primarily related to supply chain constraints and coverage for folks without comorbidities like diabetes or cardiovascular conditions. In the short term, bariatric surgery may still have a little bit of room to grow, but from chatting with many of our programs, we're starting to see that bit of plateau in surgical cases. So it's like that little inkling of, what is to come? And these short-term constraints right now, they'll play themselves out. Supply chain will not be an issue mid to long term. There are so many of these medications, just like semaglutide and tirzepatide, that we see right now in the pipeline. In fact, one just finished up phase 2 clinical trials with an average of 19% weight loss. But what's going to remain are those long-term benefits of these medications. Not only the bread and butter of weight loss and lowering A1C, but we've learned in this past year that these medications prevent adverse outcomes related to cardiovascular conditions, renal conditions. We've even seen them most recently published studies how these medications can help conditions like sleep apnea. Overall, it's really exciting. This is a positive story right now related to innovation. Thinking long term, it really begs the question, if you didn't have cardiometabolic conditions in your inpatient setting, because more and more of these folks are connected to that upfront preventative care of the GLP-1 medications, what would your inpatient setting look like? And what could you fill it with instead of those conditions?
It really begs the question, are there ways that we can help to decant preventable inpatient admissions by improving care management upstream? What can we tackle in the ambulatory care setting or at home via a medication that can then help to open up capacity in the ED or inpatient care setting?
Completely. And one of the strongest areas we see this in right now is the type 2 diabetic population, with the use of continuous glucose monitors, the use of remote patient monitoring efforts in conjunction with the use of GLP-1 medications to get that patient in a place where they don't need to visit the ED or they don't need an inpatient stay.
In addition to introducing immune effector cell therapy as a new procedure this year, we also introduced a new procedure that is really impacting the neurosciences service line, and that's percutaneous ablation and embolization. Gurmeet, could you share some of the exciting stories that we're accounting for there?
Yeah, the outpatient percutaneous ablation and embolization procedure, that's nearly forecastable for the abnormal gait and movement disorders care family in 2024. And here, this represents focused ultrasound for essential tremor. We see significant growth that's expected as a growing number of institutions are beginning to adopt this technology. For those who are not familiar, focused ultrasound, otherwise formerly known in the literature as magnetic resonance guided focused ultrasound or MRGFUS, it's a form of incisionless stereotactic surgery, which uses 3D imaging modalities to identify or target tissue, and it uses the high-intensity focused ultrasound for the treatment via thermal ablation. It can actually be an attractive alternative to surgery as it's non-invasive, it doesn't utilize ionizing radiation, and it's performed as an outpatient procedure with minimal sedation. Over the past years, there's been many indications within the neurosciences. In 2016, it was approved for patients with essential tremor, 2018 for tremor-dominant Parkinson's disease, and late 2021 for advanced Parkinson's disease with motor symptoms. And just recently, it's been treated to be for both sides of the brain for essential tremor patients. When we're looking at focused ultrasound, there's a lot of research being done with this technology, and a lot of applications are currently under clinical investigation. It spans chronic neuropathic pain, epilepsy, various types of brain tumors, as well as neurodegenerative diseases and psychiatric conditions. So a lot of conditions are being investigated with this technology. There are also studies that are underway to assess the effectiveness of lower intensity and pulse frequency focused ultrasound, and especially using that to open up the blood-brain barrier for treatment and drug delivery.
I feel like we've really run the gamut on innovation advances in the last year that we've baked into the forecast. And so, Emily, Gurmeet, Setu, I cannot thank you enough for joining me today to talk about some of these exciting stories. I hope to have you on a podcast again soon.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at SG2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, SG2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You can find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.